Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Salutations to anyone listening on the Temple Beth Am podcast whenever you happen to be listening and wherever you happen to be listening. We're now back to finally consistent rhythm. The calendar has been crazy recently, and I appreciate everyone's flexibility. But we're now going to be meeting regularly for months in a row, barring any catastrophe. Okay, so we are in the 5th chapter of the book of Shemot. We read verse 6 the last time we met, which was 2 weeks ago. Let's read it again. We have some really interesting chunky Rashis coming up, something having to do with sermonica, some pure grammar. And it'll be another opportunity for us to go slowly through a section that whose basic outline you could tell by heart. If I put you on the spot right now and ask you to tell me about the Israelites and the taskmasters and Pharaoh, you could tell the basic story, but there are details when we go slowly that are illuminating both narratively and also kind of characterologically as we think about the emergence of our people, the way the Torah tells it. So chapter 5, verse 6, Vayitzav Paro bayom hahu, on that very day. What very day? On the day that Moshe and Aaron, and not the elders, said we need to take them out to go worship to our God. And just a reminder that verse 5 and verse 6, and thank you for the reminder, Larry, that we're on verse 6. We discussed this last time. 2 verses in a row that Pharaoh is speaking without an interruption, which at least begs the question of how it got edited in this exact way, right? Because verse 5 was Pharaoh said to Moses and Aaron that you're getting in the way of their work, and now now he's saying etanogsim ba'am, he commanded the taskmasters, the Shotrav, and its officials, its officers, we would use the word policeman now, but that's a very modern word, lemor, saying, and we don't know the content of what he says yet, but he's addressing 2 categories of people. The noges, the word lingos means to drive hard, to supervise harshly, and et shotrav. And the reason why it's et shotrav is it's the it of shotrav, because it's hashotrim shalo. The shalo is the am, the people, which is a masculine verb in the masculine noun in Hebrew. So the question is, what is an oges here and what is a shoter? And that's where we are, and we'll pick up the Rashis on hanogsim, unless anyone has a question on the shot right there. Going once? Okay. Let's see who has not read in a while. Renee, do you want to read the Rashi on hanogsim?
I would also like to dedicate our learning today to Am Yisrael, since we are going to be celebrating Israel Independence Day. And if it's available still, the Israel ceremony for Yom HaZikaron was absolutely breathtaking. If it's available and you can see it, it's worth.
Thank you. And we have our own, by the way, Tekes Ma'avar tonight, starting at 6:15. Tekes Ma'avar literally means the ritual of transition, where we move from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaTzma'ut. 6:15, I think, in the sanctuary, and then Mincha, and then a joyful Mari with aspects of Hallel to bring in Yom HaTzma'ut. And then, woohoo, annual meeting, right? The most extraordinary 90 minutes of your life every year, the annual meeting. So we hope you'll join for some or for all of that. And of course, and just so if you're confused about the date, because normally Yom HaZikaron is the 4th of ER and Yom HaAtzmaut is the 5th, it's moved up a day because we never have Yom HaAtzmaut celebrated on Shabbat or on Erev Shabbat or Shabbat for that matter. So since the 5th of ER would be Friday, this year it's moved back to Thursday, which means Yom HaZikaron is moved back to Wednesday. Okay. Yes, Renee.
הנזגים מצרים היו, והשוטרים היו ישראלים, הנוגס ממונה על כמה שוטרים, והשוטר ממונה לרדות בעושי המלאכה.
Okay, so see if you can make sense of that. The headline is that he's making a verbal distinction between a nogeis and a shoter, and he's assigning it to different categories of people in the story.
Okay. So the taskmasters, they were Egyptians, and the guards were Israelites.
Okay, so the first thing he says is we have two plural nouns in the verse. We have the plural of the nogeis and the plural of the shoter. And the first thing he wants us to know is this is not just different roles. These were roles held by different people. The nogeis were Egyptians, and the shotrim were Israelites. Okay. Go ahead.
And the taskmaster was in charge of several guards.
Good. Literally mimunat from the verb limanot, which means to appoint, right? They were appointed. It's probably connected, or at least as a cousin to the root, meaning minyan, to count, limnot, but it's not the exact same verb. But they were appointed over several shotrim, and the shoter.
And the guard was in charge of supervising the ones that didn't work. Who did work?
Good. So the verb lirdot means to have dominion over. The first time we have that verb is back in Breshit when we're told that we're urdu-bahem, that we humans have dominion over the other animals in the world. So we've got a hierarchy. We got Pharaoh. Underneath Pharaoh, I suppose we have his coterie. Then we have the Nogsim, who are Egyptian taskmasters. Underneath them, we have Shotrim, who are Israelites. And what are the Israelites are being asked to be Rodet, to have dominion over and have control over those who are actually doing the work. By the way, not to put too fine a point on it, what is this evocative of in our more recent Jewish history? Right? And maybe what were they inspired by? Right? So I'm obviously referring to
capos. Capos
Yeah.
are going on in the concentration camps.
Yeah, and the Sonder commander, right? So our worst oppressors have involuntarily, we imagine, or through some kind of a wretched pressure, our own people to be supervising the oppression. Of course, there's a lot of interesting, controversial, painful material from the Shoah about any Jew who was involved on any level in collaboration with the Nazis, right? And it's controversial because it's hard to know how to judge after the fact someone who was put in that situation, whether it's Rudolf Kastner, right? Or whether it's our dear friend Zichrono Livracha, Rachmil Hakman, who died very early on in COVID. It's hard to believe he's been gone 2 years, who survived Auschwitz, survived Birkenau by being in the Sonder Commando. The Sonder Commando meant he was essentially hired/forced, hired is too soft a word, by the Nazis to be involved in the workings of Birkenau, right? So is he a collaborator, or did he have no choice? But whatever he is, he's the shoter in this particular verse, right? Norm Rachel, I don't know if Rachel's there.
No, Rachel is in the East Side. I have a vocabulary question. How does one distinguish between a shomer and a shoter?
Good question. They rhyme, and they sound like they're from a similar family. It's an entirely different root. When we play with roots, as we've discussed before, the first two letters of a three-letter root can be a family, and sometimes the last two letters of a three-letter root can be a family. But when the roots share just the first and the third, my understanding is that it's etymologically coincidental and more for alliteration than that they are etymologically related. So shin mem resh means to guard, protect. Shin tet resh means to police and have control over. In modern Hebrew, in Israeli society, they're more closely related than in biblical Hebrew, right? So you can imagine like Shomer HaGvul, the one who's guarding the border, and the shoter, the policeman, are both part of Israel's, force to protect the nation. But in biblical Hebrew, lishmor was really mean specifically to guard or protect something, whereas shoter was not to protect something. The shotrim were not protecting anything; they're actually asserting control over. Okay. So I think they're more different biblically than they are in Israeli modern Hebrew. Tova, and then Barry.
Yeah, I actually had a question because I would have read the verse the opposite. And even in making the parallel to the Shoah, it seems like the opposite. So I just wanted to, I guess, ask that question because I had assumed when I first read it that the taskmasters of the people, because I sort of read it of the people, were fellow Israelites who were put in charge of being responsible for this group to get its work done. And the guards, the ones who enforced it in the end, were the Shotrim, the Egyptians. And the parallel in my mind was, in fact, capos who sort of, this is maybe a misunderstanding, but I always saw them as working within the Jewish prisoners. And then ultimately you had the Nazi guards.
Yeah.
So I would have read this the opposite of the way Rashi reads it. So can you explain more why he went in his direction rather than the other?
Two responses. Shot of the verse in isolation, I think it's 6 of one, half does the other. I think there's nothing that I know of in the biblical meaning of a nogais versus the biblical meaning of a shoter that wouldn't permit you to flip it if you are working from the assumption that some of them were Egyptians and some of them were Israelites. Right. Second comment, for those of you who have this one, right? Not all of you are working out of this Chumash. Those of you who have this one, there's an interesting footnote that goes to that very question. So I'll read it out loud because I can't bring that footnote onto the screen like I can with other sources on Sefaria. So it's footnote 37, which is in the last line of the Rashi, which is on page Nun Vav of this Chumash, on the word Hashotrim Yisraelim, that the Shotrim were Israelites. The footnote says, Di'im lokein, because if it were not this way, in some ways actually speaking to like a phantom comment like yours, Tova, like the editor is actually anticipating your comment, which is to your credit, right? The editor is saying, well, why couldn't have Rashi read it the other way around? Di'im lokein, lama hayu hashotrim soakim. Why would it have been that the Shotrim were shouting El Paro to Pharaoh, Velo Hanogsim, and not the taskmasters? Velamayu Shotrim, and why were the Shotrim Mukim, hit and battered Velo Hanogsim, and not the taskmasters? What's he referring to? Flip ahead in whichever Chumash you have to verse 14 of this chapter. Actually 13 and 14. We'll do this section slower when we get there, which is a few verses later. In verse 13, because Pharaoh is going to be speaking for a while about what this new edict is. Verse 13, Hanogsim atsim lemor. The taskmasters kind of pressed hard, saying, Kalu masechem devar yom yom, finish the work you have to do every day, kasher biyot hateven, to make all the straw. That's what the Nogsim were doing. And what were the Shotrim doing? Vayuku ha-Shotrim. The Shotrim of the children of Israel, which grammatically could mean the officers over them, not the officers from among them, but they were beaten, right? The Shotrim were beaten. Asher samu alehem nogsei Pharaoh. The Shotrim that the Nogsim had put in charge of the Israelites were beaten. And go back to now verse 15, Vayavo Shotrei Bnei Israel, and those Shotrim, Vayitzaku el Paro, and they shouted to Pharaoh. So Rashi doesn't reference it, but it's kind of built into the pshat later on that whoever the Nogais was, they were pressing this new edict hard, and whoever the Shoter was, they were shouting out to Pharaoh, and they were actually beaten for the lack of Israelite fulfillment of this new edict. By inference, doesn't have to be the way, by inference, you could imagine of the two layers of a hierarchy, who are the ones who are more likely to be pressing more? The Egyptians. Who are the ones more likely to be shouting out and being beaten for lack of fulfillment? The Israelites. So again, in its own context, out of context, that one verse could you read either way, but that's how this editor chooses to explain Rashi's read, and I think it makes sense given what's coming up.
Everett Fox also says that in several of the Semitic languages, nagot denotes pressing or overpowering.
Yeah. So pressing and overpowering on its own could also be referred to referring to the capos, but it's hard to make sense of verses 13, 14, 15 coming up if you don't flip them.
Right. No, I agree that does clarify it. But I just have to say, from a Egyptological perspective, one of the things is that we know quite a bit about how work gangs were organized in Egypt. Admittedly, work gangs that were corvée, not slave labor, but corvée, local people who worked during the season of the flood to do the massive building projects like the pyramids and later monuments. And they were organized into work gangs that were very self-identified. They were almost like sports teams. They had their own names. They would put their names on the blocks that they had placed in the pyramid. You can actually find the names of the work gangs that placed those blocks. And there was sort of an esprit de corps around them. And they, as I said, they gave themselves these names, and they were hierarchically organized within their own group, so to speak. Now, that doesn't necessarily obviously speak to this situation where you're talking about slave labor, but historically in other contexts, that's the way these kind of work gangs would have been organized. So for what it's worth.
They actually found inscriptions identifying the, wow.
Absolutely. They've actually found, one of the oldest papyri found describes the bringing of blocks, huge blocks up the Nile River.
Wow.
And describing the gang that's doing it, the name of it, and it's clear that there's even a competition between gangs to get more work done.
Wow.
It's quite fascinating.
Did any of them say like the Hebrew hammers or something, or a little Bet Hey saying Bezrat Hashem?
Right. Well, as I said, a lot of these are from an earlier period where we were talking about corvée labor, so it's a very different kind of system. But
what's that word, corvée? Is that an English word?
Corvée, it's actually a French in origin, but it is used in English. It's labor that's not forced labor. In other words, the pyramids were not built by slaves. They were built by the population, drafted into work as a kind of tax. It was a tax they were paying during the period of the flood when the farmers couldn't farm their fields. They had to wait for the floods to go back. So it was over a period of several months. And it was not slavery. It was really seen as paying a tax and participating in a project that most people bought into.
How do you spell that word?
Corve accent aigu E.
Corvée. Fascinating. Thank you for that. And I agree with what Sue wrote. Your knowledge and expertise is impressive and adds so much to this conversation. So I'm so grateful that you share it when you have something. Great. Let's go to Barry. Don't hear you yet, Barry.
All right, unmute. There was a question earlier, like an hour ago, about Shemor and Shoter. And it just came to me, the poetic tree of Shemor as a whore. It's like a voluntary taken upon to do these things. Shoter, it's not a voluntary. And also just the automatopoeia of Shemor as a softer, and Shoter is like a hit.
That second comment is really interesting because we do know that organically words sometimes were organically created to have a sound that matches its meaning, right? Like think of how many languages the word for mother is, aligns with one of the first sounds that the baby makes. So that's interesting. And yes, in the biblical language of Hebrew, lishmor has almost an entirely positive association: to protect or volunteer or to be commanded by God to protect and guard something that is precious, which is very different than a shoter. Thank you for that, Barry. Rebecca?
Can you hear me?
I can, look better. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the word shoter, which is also linked to shtar in Hebrew, like shtar chov, a bill. And if you look up the root for shtar, the origin is supposedly Akkadian, which means something written or to write. And so it sounds like shoter in this case is sort of like the person authorized perhaps by the Nogsim or by Paro to look over the workers. So it sort of agrees with Tova's view from the history there. So it's more of it's less of a I think it says less of what they're actually doing and more about the fact that they're authorized to be in charge to some extent.
That is fascinating. And you know, what's so wonderful about this study is that there are insights happening all the time. I don't think I'm consciously aware of even once in my life connecting the word shoter with shtar, even though I've used both words all the time in Hebrew, modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew. Shtar is a document, for those who don't recognize the reference. I just didn't think of it once, what the connection is. I'm just seeing if BDB, let's go to BDB a second and see if there's anything there. I'll share screen. What does BDB say? Assyrian right, sataru, very good. And shoter, official officer, a scribe, secretary. Look at that. That a shoter comes from that root. I never thought about that. Or an arranger, an organizer, a subordinate officer which we'll get in Parshat Shoftim, Shoftim b'Shotrim. Interesting. Yeah, I forgot that in Parshat Shoftim, Shotrim was also the second. You have a Shofet and you have a Shoter, and the Shoter seems to be an underling, but it comes from the notion of right. Thank you for that. That's really rich. Okay, great. Alan, you are next, and then we'll see what Rashi has to say next.
Yeah, I was just wanted to say if it seems that from the very pshat of verse 14 in chapter 5 that you have the hierarchy set because it says that the Shotrei B'nai Yisrael Asher Samu Alehem Nikshe Paro. So it shows that they were actually designated by the Nikshe, the Nokshim were the ones who designated the Shotrim. So that would be an express reference to what the hierarchy was.
Right. At this point back in verse 6, we don't have that yet, right?
Right.
You're right. And just to correct one thing, because I know you like precision, it's a sin, not a shin. So it's a nogeis, not a nogesh.
Thank you.
But you're absolutely right that the relationship that Rashi is talking about now seems to be clarified later on, which is what that footnote was pointing us towards. Exactly right. Okay. Anything else on? This is the one Rashi on verse 6. Anything else before we go to verse 7? Going once. Okay. Let's go to verse 7. Joanna, are you able to read? Are you there, Joanna? Okay. If you are, great. But let's move forward. Joel, do you want to read verse 7? Hope you're okay, Joanna.
לא תוסיפון לתת תבן לעם ללבון הלבנים כתמול שלשום הם ילכו וקששו להם תבן.
Okay.
Do not gather to give straw to the people. And they turned a noun into a verb, lilbon levanim.
Good.
To brick bricks.
Good.
As you did yesterday and the day before, they will go and will gather the straw themselves.
Good. So excellent first read. That verb lo tosifun is written very oddly. You correctly noted, consciously or unconsciously, there's an aleph after the taf, which seems to suggest that the root is osef, like chagasif, like an asefa, a gathering, like Sukkot is the festival gathering. But if you look quickly at Onkelos, he turns it, he pretends the aleph is not there, lo tosfun, without an aleph. And what would the root be if there's no aleph and it was just lo tosfun with taf samech pei?
You shall not add?
Correct, like Yosef. Right. So most people understand that the root here is having to do with additional rather than gathering. Why the aleph is there, I've never found a good explanation for it. Maybe that's an old Hebrew way of writing even the root lahosif, to add on.
Why are they jumping through hoops to make the aleph not there when it could make sense with the aleph there?
But how? It translated it see if you can translate it again unclunkily with it meaning gathering.
You shall not gather to give them straw. You shall not gather the straw to give to them. No?
Yeah, I think it's stretchy because the meaning that makes more sense is, particularly as there's going to be reference later in the verse to what you had been doing up until now. I think it just makes more sense. Maybe I'm just moved by the primary translation is don't continue to. Up until now, they've had to make the bricks from the heaven you've given to them. Don't do that anymore. That's what is harsher about this particular decree. So I suppose it's possible, and if you go with legio difficultare, right, that the reading that makes less sense, maybe the more original one, because it's less likely that it was switched to a harder one. It's possible. Everett Fox doesn't mean he's the only. Everett Fox is not God, but Everett Fox translates it as "you are no longer to," from the notion of continuing. Additionally, I'd be curious to see if any of the translations in front of Larry in particular read it as osef rather than lehosif. And let's just go, before I get Stevie and Barry, I love your, Joel, how you reference little bone levanim, a very Hebrew thing to verb the noun, right? Whatever it means to lovain, what you do when you're lovaining is you're making levanim. We can't do that in English. You don't brick a brick. But we have a sense of what it means to form the brick. In some ways, we have that in English, but not nearly as commonly as in Hebrew. Kitmol shalshom, don't make the bricks like the great coffee shop, bookshop in Jerusalem, I think is the reference here, but if you know that reference. Kitmol shalshom literally means like yesterday and the day before, and we'll figure out what that means in context. Let them go, heim yelchu. And kosheshu lahem tevin. Let's pause on kosheshu lahem. Anyone have any associations with the verb likshosh, kuf shin shin, and what it's doing here? Stevie, I see you unmuted.
The Makoshish Eitzim, the stick gatherer that gets executed for violating Shabbos, presumably. But some actually do read it as that's not the reason, but anyway, putting aside.
Before you keep going, let me just show everybody that verse. So later on in Sefer B'Midbar, Vayehu b'nei Yisrael b'Midbar, the Israelites were in the wilderness. Vayimtzeu ish, they found a person who was mikoshesh eitzim. He was by inference gathering wood. Yom HaShabbat, and he was killed, and it's a short narrative talking about the sanctity of Shabbat. So here, koshesh seems to gather. Any other references that people have in their mind to the verb likshosh?
Also a little bit like koshi, kushia, difficulty.
That's interesting. That's from kufshin hey, whereas this seems to be like usually when you have a second letter doubled in a root, it's an intensifying or an expansion of the two-letter root. What does kash mean in modern Hebrew? Straw, right? So now it's hard to know what's the chicken and what's the egg. That maybe the reason kash means straw is because this verb, right? But if kash means straw, then koshesh means to do the thing you do with straw. What do you do with straw? You collect, right? Interesting. Kashish has another meaning. I think I have this open in BDB. Hold on.
Is it related at all to kosher, like shul?
Don't think so.
It was Yad L'Kashish, a place where they made things in Jerusalem.
Good. So look at BDB on koshesh. Kashash means to be old or to be dried up, right? So Yad L'Kashish is an extraordinary place in Jerusalem founded by Miriam Mendelo, Zichronah Lebracha, that basically gives elderly members of the Jerusalem community something to be productive in. And they, for at least a generation, U.S. Wires had talus bags that were woven together by people at Yad L'Kashish. And so the connection is, and this sounds, I hope it doesn't sound the wrong way, old and wrinkled, right? Dried up. So a kashish is a person that is dried up from their vitality as a piece of straw is a dried up stalk of grain, right? So that may be the connection there. So going back into our verse, they should be going to koshesh, to collect the straw or to do something with the straw that will be ultimately turned into the Lebeni. And that's a lot harder of a task, particularly when we get to the next verse, which we'll get to in a few seconds. Barry?
Well, I'm looking at, again, the balance of the sentence. It begins with the term, I lost my place here, the first term for gathering with the aleph in it. And
that's verse 7, yeah.
And the question was why the aleph? But it ends, the other part of the sentence also talking about gathering, but the last part of the sentence, they'll straw their own straw. And the first part is, as before, you have been a gathering to give to them. So it begins with serving to them, the gathering, and the last part is it's very hard. Let them straw their straw.
Let them straw their straw. Yeah.
So it becomes intensified. It's not just as before; it's intensified by this poetic structure.
Yeah, and if you look at the Onkelos, the translation of koshesh into Aramaic, he renders it as yigabavun lahon tivna. So tivna is the noun Aramaic for teven, which means that the raw materials from which you make bricks, and govev is an intensifying of goveh. What's a goveh? A gabai. Originally, a gabai was not someone who called someone up to the Torah and said a mishaberach. A gabai was a collector, a tax collector. So a gobev is like someone who's bringing stuff in and heaping up a pile of. So that's how he renders koshesh. Okay, Barbara, and then we'll go back to Joel and see what Rashi says in the verse.
This is just a question. Why in the Bible is straw teven, but now you say in modern days it's kash? Why did they change? Why did they give up on the word teven that's biblical and use the other word nowadays? I'm just curious.
I think the best way to answer that is there are synonyms even in Hebrew, right? So there are words that mean similar things, and maybe Rebecca Menace can correct me on this. I think in modern Hebrew, I know that kash means the straw that you drink from. I don't know if you're a farmer and you're baling up hay, if the word there is kash or not. I just don't know. I've never done that. And it might be that teven is still used, but I think whether or not that's the case, synonyms, right? Mild, subtle differences of meaning that represent, different aspects of a very similar thing sometimes just proliferate. And there's some biblical words that are used, and there's some words that were created anew when Hebrew got reinvented. I don't know if farmers to this day use the word teven. Sue, what did Sue say?
Kash. They use kash.
Anyone? Do you know if teven is used?
Teven is also used. I think their kash is more. They're both used.
Got it. Great. But good question, Barbara. Okay, Joel, let's go to Rashi. Rashi's going to have a lot of things to say on this verse. And those who happen to know medieval French are going to have a leg up.
Teven, esh de bole, belozi. In Old French, es de bole. Hayu govlim otam im hatit. And I don't know, govlim is, my translation says knead it into the clay.
Right.
So they would knead the straw into the clay to make it more usable.
Right. So you would take the teven, and what you would do, and whatever teven is, he's saying it in ancient French, it's estoublé or something like that, or estoublé, and you would govel, you would knead or mix it in. One of the Rashis I have in front of me, has like a commentary on the Rashi, a running almost like translation of the Rashi says, Govlin means arvin v'lashin. Arvin means to mix together, and lashin means to knead, like dough. The moist mud into the tevin, and that what makes the mortar. Okay. Anyone who either knows French or knows English have any guess as to the modern etymological cousin to Rashi's estouble?
Stubble.
Stubble.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Etouble, stubble. It's the same word.
Right. Okay, so let me show you. I found today that this was online, which is amazing what's online. There is a wonderful book called Otsar Loazé Rashi. It's a list of all of the French words that Rashi uses throughout his commentary on Tanakh and commentary on the Talmud, and renders it into English the way we used to do this in rabbinical school before Sefaria. In the back, at least when we're studying Talmud, in the back of a standard Vilna edition of the Talmud, there's something I think I referenced before called the Hamatargim, the translator, who would translate Rashi's French words into Yiddish. And then we would take the Yiddish word and go to a Yiddish English dictionary, and that's how we'd go. We'd go like Hebrew or to Aramaic, and Aramaic to Old French to Yiddish. It was the telephone game, and sometimes it would help us out. So this is entry number 3070, Teven, Estoble, Kash, right? Hanishar basadeh acharei katzir. The stuff that it stays on the field after the harvest, not the stuff that's been left, like cut but was left behind, but still attached to the ground, the stubble. And but Sorfatit Shahayom in modern French, etule, Anglit in English, stubble, the Germanit, stoppel. Okay, so that all of a sudden makes sense. That Rashi's saying, what are we referring to here? It's not the straw that was used for feeding animals. It's the leftover stuff, right, that got mixed with some mud to make bricks and mortar, right? It's showing that bricks were, at least the Egyptians were good recyclers, okay? Let me see if there's anything else in that verse I wanted to say before we see whose hand is up. While I'm thinking about that, I see Rick's hand.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so in my Silverman, it does give the Old French estouble and then the English stubble, just to let everybody know it's in the Silverman. For the rest of the chapter, they're talking about the straw and not having it, and I just have a macro kind of question. If the object is to make bricks so you can build things, why would you take away the supplies of your slaves in order to punish them? The only effect is they're not going to be able to make as many bricks. So you can punish them all sorts of ways. You could beat them. You could do all sorts of horrible things. But why this particular thing? And it goes on sentence after sentence. I was trying to find something else to do with the Teven, but it's like, it doesn't make sense just operationally. So just wanted to ask that.
Once again, Rick, you're proving that you are not a cruel person. Your mind can't even conceive of a way of trying to extract more than is possible out of even one's slave, right? Because you're not a sadist. But if you're a sadist, then you delude yourself into thinking that that the way to make them suffer is to require even more than what. So if they slept 3 hours yesterday, well, they'll sleep 2 hours today. So kol hakavod for reinforcing to us that your mind doesn't operate the way a tyrant's does. But there are tyrants, right? There are tyrants who imagine that you've pushed a population, even the population that you're relying on to help you to the limit. I can push him even more. And sometimes that crushes the individual, and sometimes that pushes the individual or the community so far that it snaps back against the tyrant. That's obviously what we hope and pray for in that situation. So you're right to ask the question because you're a good man.
Could I speak to that point?
Please, yeah.
It echoed for me because I was thinking about the same thing. It seems to me that all along that yes, Pharaoh wants them working because he wants the product. He wants the result of their labors. But I always feel like it's also because he's using it as a method of control. Because as people has become large and potentially threatening, you want to keep them working. And so by this form of punishment, he's increasing their work and the time that they're building, exhausting them more, and especially in the aftermath of a bid to take them away, at least briefly, lest that stir up any kind of trouble. Let's make their job even more exhausting and more time consuming.
Yeah. And what's that one line midrash in the Haggadah, right? In the Arami Oved Avi section, my father's a wandering Aramean, which is this extended, simple midrash section of the Haggadah. I believe that the midrash on Vayavidu Otam Befarach, that they made them work Befarach. What does the word Befarach mean? It means we often translate it as ruthlessly. I think the midrash on the Haggadah is made them work purposelessly, right? Like it was work for its own sake. That it's not that Pharaoh was so reliant on them economically. And for the moment, I'm staying in a midrashic world and not a historic world, right? So this may not have been, made sense if you're thinking about ancient economy, but that it was work that wasn't even producing something that was needed. It was work for its own sake. So if you're making someone work just for their own sake, just for your own sake, and not because you need the product, then you can just keep making them make more. And so if it's more ruthless, that's the point. There's a terribly poignant scene in Schindler's List where the Amon Gut character, played by Ralph Fiennes, goes to Schindler's factory, and he's touring it, and they're making the pots and the pans, and there's an old Jew, I think he was the rabbi, who marries the couple at the end of the movie, is operating his machine, and the Nazi, show me how you do it, and he does it very quickly, and he's proud to show him that he works the machine so quickly. And then Gert says, so if you can do it that quickly, how long is your shift today, and how come your pile is that small, right? It's very evocative of this scene, right? Whether consciously or unconsciously. So if you can indeed work that efficiently, how come you haven't been working that efficiently since the moment you got to work today? And then they bring him out to the back and they threaten to shoot him, and the gun doesn't shoot. It's a terrible scene. The guy thinks he's going to die, and then the gun, what's the word? It hitches.
Misfire.
Jams.
It jams. Thank you. So it's a terrible scene, but it's evocative of, if your ruthlessness is ruthless for its own sake, then near max productivity is no longer a barrier. It's no longer a ceiling. Push it even worse than that. Okay, I think I saw Joanna's hand up next, so go ahead.
I think another quality of a ruthless tyrant is this concept that you're so focused on oppressing the other that the thought of protecting or doing good for your own people becomes, way down the totem pole in the scheme of things for you. And I think that's going to become even more evident in the plagues.
Say more about that last sentence.
Because time after time in the plagues, especially by the time Paro starts to get warnings about the plagues, if you were concerned about your own people, you would heed the warning. You would protect your people. But
very good, Joanna. And so if you combine the last two comments together, what Rick and Joanna said, we're seeing the Torah, as we go slowly, really describe what a maniac is, and really describe what a tyrant is, and really describe the difference between a benevolent autocrat and a tyrant who, even when it seems like the tyrant is trying to do what's best for the society and the civilization and the people in it, is a madman or a madwoman, and only focused, and even to that society and that economy's own disfavor, is simply expressing ruthlessness for its own sake. Great, that's a wonderful connection. Thank you for that, Joanna. Norm, and then we'll keep going.
While we were still talking about the cognates or the translations of the word, the German is actually Stoppel. It is a direct relationship to the Yiddish word Stopp, and which means to stuff, and it means stuff also in German. And they kneaded or stuffed the straw in with the clay. And in the same way, it has numerous meanings in German and in Yiddish, some of which are appropriate for this class and some of which are not, that use that same concept.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Norm. Now, the next time I hear the word shtup, I'll think of Shemot and not other things. Barry.
Yeah, I had a comment earlier, then my whole internet went out and had to go back in again. So as a clay person, straw, meaning the long strands of straw that grow in the ground, cannot be mushed into clay. That won't work. If the clay was wet, like liquidy soup, you might stir long straw into that, but when it dried, it would crack because the long strands of straw would not adhere to the clay. But now we have the word stubble, which I imagine to be crushed up pieces of straw. Now that can be either stirred into wet clay or kneaded into clay that's more like dough. But it'd have to be crushed up pieces of straw.
Once again, reminding us that this material is always better studied with both a historian and a potter amongst us. And I'll use this opportunity to praise Barry for years, if not decades, I'm sure, of being the producer of the Kiddush cups that we give to B'nai Mitzvah students as an artisan potter. So you're part of the legacy that every Bar Bat Mitzvah student gets in our community. And we're so appreciative of that. Thank you, Barry. Okay, back to Joel, because we did the Rashi on Tevin, but now we're going to get the Rashi on Levanim, which is interesting because if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the very few times where take that back. Tevin appears early in the verse too. I was thinking that it was out of order because the last word of the verse is Tevin, but I forgot that it's also in Lo Tosifun Latei Tevin. So Rashi comments on Tevin, and now on Levanim. Joel?
Levanim, Tiulish, below as lead. I have Tiules, Tiulis.
So we'll look at that Loezi Rashi in a bit. To finish off the comment to Rashi.
Shosim mitit, that is made from the clay. Umeyavshim otam bechama, and it's dried out in an oven.
No.
The sun.
The sun. Chama is the sun here, right?
V'yesh sorfim otam b'kivsan.
Kivshan.
Kivshan. And there are those who dry it out in an oven.
Yeah, or a furnace. Good. Okay, so the first thing Rashi does is give us another French word. Before I bring up the Otsar Rashi again.
Chama is another one of those words that, for Barbara's sake, that modern Israel didn't take the biblical word. They took a different word.
Right, and also moon, right? Yeah, we have Yareach and Levana, right? They're the same word, but they're just different synonyms of the same word. So if anyone who has not, quote unquote, checked and cheated, and before I bring up the Loezi Rashi, anyone want to give a guess as to what the French that's being rendered here as tiule or tulish?
Tiles.
Very good. Okay, so let me bring it up again. Let's see what the Otsar Loezi Rashi shows. I'm pretty sure that Barry is correct.
And the sun in Egypt there, Tova would agree, would be as hot as a furnace.
Right. So entry number 3071 in Loezi Rashi, our verse chapter 5 and 7. The word in question is the Benim. Rashi renders it as tiulis. That would be spelled like the transliteration of that into English as tiule. And the modern Hebrew word, which I didn't know this word, is ra'afim. So the things that are made from that mixture of the straw and the clay. Now, was anyone on this trip? Anyone in this class on the Morocco trip with us? Yes, Rebecca and Leonard. What does this remind you of? to put you on the spot, or anyone else who was on it. I think Sue was on. No, Sue was not on it. Anyone who's in Morocco with us, what does this remind you of? Barbara, what does this remind you of? In Fez, we went to a factory in Fez where we see people making exquisite tiles. I think of a tile as like a beautiful thing to put, to line a backstop in a kitchen. But how a tile is often clay, and we saw the production that's probably not changed in hundreds, if not thousands of years, of people getting the raw material and mixing it together, and then forming it, and then firing it, and then painting it. And it was really, in my mind, it connected the word tile with this notion of a lumpy clay that has both, the liquid in it of the mud, and also the organic material that holds it together. That's what at least it reminds me of. Good. Anybody else want to say anything on this Rashi, right? Where he's just defining the term, and he's telling us the two different ways of making it. If not, I want to show you something else, which I'm surprised Rashi doesn't make reference to in this comment. This is not the first time that we've had the word levenim in the Torah, nor is it the first time that Rashi comments on it. So back in the Tower of Babel story, chapter 11 of Breshit, verse 3, I'm on the left side of the page. Vayomru isharehu, each person said to his fellow, Hava nil bana lebenim. There, Joel, is your bricking bricks, right? Come, let us, lovein the levenim, make bricks. The nisrafa l'sreifa will, that's another one. We'll burn it to a burnt crisp. Vatahi halevena la'aven. It's a really oddly constructed verse. The livena, the burning or the making the bricks will become like a stone to us. The hachemar hayalahem lachomer is translated here as the bitumen served them as mortar. Forget about breaking down that verse so much, because that's when we get back to Parshat Noach later on in the Torah, we'll get there. What Rashi says, v'nisrafa l'sreifa kach osin halebenim. That's how you would make the lebenim, what we would call bricks. Shekarin tule, which are called tule. We now know that word. Beloazi sorfin otan bakishan. Burn them in a furnace. Interestingly, here Rashi only refers to the making them in the furnace, and for some reason, maybe this is Rashi's knowledge of or guess at the way these things were done in Egypt. Says it could also be done in the heat of the sun. Rick and then Barry.
Just before we leave a sentence, there's a nice little trope thing. There's a yativ on Haim, Yehu, they will go, or whatever tense that is, but it's like a little bit of a foreshadow of the Israelites leaving. The lechu we've seen before. He tells Moses and Aaron to go, so it's all about going and not going. But I like the little glimpse of them leaving.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about the glimpse of the leaving. I've always, as a laner, found the yativ on that haim to be like an exclamation point, because that's where the tyranny comes out. Up until now, it's been hard enough for them to make the bricks when we've given them, but now, haim yahu, they're the ones who are going to go out and gather it themselves, as if they have any more energy, any energy left. Yeah. Barry and then Joanna. You're muted, Barry.
Going back to clay and the properties of drying the clay out in the sun or a low-level heated oven is called bisqueware. Bisqueware over time with rain and water will wear down. It's hard, but it will crumble. If you put it into a higher hot oven at the highest temperature, the chemical properties of the clay changes, and it comes out hard as stone. In fact, that's what we call stoneware.
You mean stoneware is not from stone, it's from clay that is produced the way that's as hard as stone?
it's been fired at a very high temperature, over 2,000 degrees.
Wow.
And its chemical property changes, and so we call that stoneware. It's not as hard as stone, like from a mountain stone, but it will last for a long time. And so that's what they're getting out here in your terms.
That's helpful. It has implications for kashrut, because actual stoneware does not need to be koshered, or can be koshered easily. But things that are made from clay, most people would say they cannot be koshered. So
right, because clay stoneware seems like stone, but cracks will be in there, and those cracks will kashrut.
Thank you, Barry. Joanna and then Rebecca, that's probably all we'll have time for today.
I too was having internet problems at the beginning, and I only caught bits of the conversation about kash, so I'm not sure if this came up, but as we were talking now, what popped out at me was the use of the verb kosheshu. Why not the more common verbs for gather, le'asoph or lilkot? And the other thing that popped into my head, interestingly, as I started to think about this shoresh, is another place in another context where it's used, which is in Bamidbar with the stick gatherer on Shabbat. So it seems possibly that this verb is used specifically to gather short, stubbly things, which then sort of supports the definition of tevin that we were talking about.
Yeah, so when your internet was out, we had brought that verse up onto the screen because that is the other, I think it's the only other place where kuf shin shin is used in the Torah. Could be wrong. And what we'll get to next time is Rashi's very, I think it's like a one-word comment. Yeah, so I won't give the story away, but it's a one-word comment.
It is the only other place in Chumash. It comes up once else in Tanakh where Elijah encounters this woman who's also Makoshesh Eitzim.
Got it. So, and the question is, Joel was mentioning before that the lilbon levenim is that common Hebrew thing of where the verb matches the noun. If kash as a noun existed in concept back then, which I don't know, we could have had another, because it could have been the kosheshu lahem kash. But it's close enough that it suggests that maybe the reason why it's koshesh here and not locate, and Rashi will weigh in on that, is because the verb koshesh might be built from the word that actually means straw. Rebecca, last comment of the day.
Okay, I'll make it really quick. I'm still with the word lilaben and livanim.
Mm-hmm.
What I think of when I hear the word lilaben has to do with heating something to the point where it turns white. And I think, I'm not sure about ceramics exactly, but I think you're taking the clay, and by burning it, you're making it what you're bleaching it, I guess. And that word is later used in other contexts of really, even a heated discussion on something to get the essence out of something. So I don't know if the word livena comes from making something white, but I think lilaben, there might be some connection there.
That's great, right? Because we would normally not associate the English word brick with anything that has to do with something white. In going back to kashrut, one of the ways in which you kosher something is called libun kal or libun gamor, and it's heating something to the point of its being blanched of all of its color, and that will help it get rid of any taste that was brought into it. So that's libun. It's libun kal, lightning, or libun chamor, like more intense whitening of the object. So those things I think are very much related.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.